Alright, so buying a mountain bike, episode 1. This here is Max the cat, so if you hear some meowing, and this is just who it is. Some of you have seen my other videos, may have seen Max wandering around. He's in my Bronson bike check video. But, anyway, buying a mountain bike. So, one of the first things I think we should talk about is the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is, of course, price. If you have sort of gone on YouTube maybe and looked at a couple videos and checked out a few bike reviews, you may have seen some prices that gave you a heart attack. And let me say that you don't need to spend thousands of dollars to get into the sport. On the other hand, you're not going to go out and buy a $200 or $300, probably even a $400 mountain bike and get into the sport. Not unless you buy something used. And I'm going to be talking about primarily buying a new bike here. I would say to get into it, you probably need to steel yourself that you're going to spend at least $800. And you could spend probably in the $800 to about $1,300 range. Or you might be spending somewhere in the $2 to maybe $3,500 range, depending on kind of what kind of bike you want to get into. And we'll talk about that, if not in this episode, in other episodes, a little bit more detail. But first question is, well, why am I going to need to spend $800 or more, likely more, on a mountain bike? Well, the reason is you want a bike that's going to not kill the fun, kill the joy of the mountain biking experience. Especially if you're first getting into the sport, you've not really ridden mountain bikes or any sort of bike that goes in the dirt before. If, say, maybe you're just coming to mountain biking as a complete newbie to bikes generally. I mean, maybe you haven't ridden bikes really since you were a kid. Or maybe you're coming from a road riding experience and getting onto the dirt. The easiest way to give up on the sport quickly is to have a bad experience. And one of the easiest ways to have a bad experience is to have a bike that's not made for the job. So, how do you have a bike that's not made for the job? You buy something that's cheap, primarily with cheap components. That's going to really, quite honestly, be the thing that's really going to be the biggest killjoy. And you're going to get out there and you're not going to have fun. Why? For example, the drivetrain. So this is the derailleur. A lot about that, fellow YouTubers, robocalls. So where was I? Oh, right, the drivetrain. So most mountain bikes have what's called a one-by system. So they only have one derailleur. They've gotten rid of the rear derailleur, the front derailleur, and they only have one on the rear. And what you see is a cassette, that's the multiple chain rings that's on the back wheel, that has that's big, goes from a very small chain ring all the way up to a very big one, and then you have a relatively small chain ring on the front, with no shifter on the front at all, no derailleur on the front, just one on the rear. But some of your cheaper mountain bikes, if you do get one in the $800, $900 range, they may have what's called a 2-by system, most likely. And that is where you have a front derailleur that'll have 2 chain rings on it, as well as a rear derailleur that'll probably have 8, 10, 11 gears on in the back. The 3-by system, drivetrain system, where you have 3 chain rings on the front, is kind of gone in mountain bikes. I don't think if you're buying a new bike you're likely to find one of those anymore. But if you buy a cheaper bike and it has cheaper derailleurs and cheaper shifters, what you're going to find is that they're not going to shift very crisply, they're not going to shift very cleanly. After a little bit of use, they get knocked out of alignment just a slight bit. They're not going to shift very well at all. You're going to find that you're going about to go up a hill, you're trying to shift into the right gear and it won't get in the right gear. You start to go down the hill and you're trying to shift into the gear, the bigger gear, so that you can go down and pedal and pick up speed, and it's not going into the right gear. And that just completely kills the fun in a ride. When you're trying to get up that hill and it won't go in, and then you've got to stop and hop off the bike and walk it up the hill and get to the top and lift your front tire and manually spin the pedals so that it shifts into the gear, or whatever you got to do. It just is a terrible experience. It's just not going to make the ride very much fun. If you're on a bike that's scary, when you're going down some of the hills, you start going over a little bit of rough patches. If it just doesn't feel safe, it doesn't feel comfortable, you feel like you're going to pull a header over the handlebars, again, that's not going to make you want to come back to the sport. So spending, I think, the little extra money and getting a bike that has good components, a bike that you feel comfortable on, what we call the geometry. That's the way the frame is designed, so that you don't feel like you're going to go over the handlebars. A bike that has handlebar widths that are comfortable for you, that has a good saddle that's comfortable for you. All of those things are going to make the ride more enjoyable. You're going to be able to really experience the sport and not get turned off by the sport, not because of anything that's wrong with the sport, but simply because you spent, you bought a cheap bike and it's making the sport seem frustrating. And that's really that's probably the word you'll get if that you'll find you use if you get a cheaper bike, is frustrating. So spend the money, not huge amounts on your first bike, but spend the money to at least get a quality bike your first time out. Okay, so let's just talk briefly about some of those things that are going to make a mountain bike more expensive, the quality that you want to get. The first thing you need to think about when you're going to start riding is, do you want a full suspension mountain bike, or what we call a hardtail? And a hardtail is a bike that just has a suspension fork, so only suspension in the front. A full suspension mountain bike is one that has not only a front suspension fork, but also has a rear shock, so that the rear wheel has suspension as well. Now, simply by adding that rear shock, you're going to jack the price up quite a bit. You're probably going to be hard pressed to find a good quality mountain bike that's a full suspension mountain bike for under probably $2,200-$2,300, and probably more likely you're going to be looking at about $2,500 to about $3,500. For a hardtail, because they don't have that rear shock, they're going to be probably running in the $800 to about maybe $1,300-$1,400 price range, depending. I mean, you can definitely get ones that are more expensive, but for a good starter bike that you're not going to spend a huge amount of money on and empty out your wallet, that's probably the range that you should be able to get a good quality hardtail on. In a later video, I'm going to talk about the benefits of a hardtail versus a full suspension. This video, I really want to just focus more on the price and what makes the prices more expensive or less expensive. So first thing is hardtail, cheaper; full suspension, more expensive. Second thing is, what's the frame made out of? The frame material. So then you have aluminum primarily, or carbon. There are a couple brands out there that make steel bikes, but by and large, you're going to be looking at a aluminum frame or a carbon fiber frame. Carbon fiber is more expensive. Aluminum is going to be cheaper. Probably for your first bike, an aluminum frame is going to be adequate. They're really nice. Yes, the carbon are beautiful, and my Bronson that I just got, which is a full suspension bike, has a carbon frame. But my first bike didn't. My first bike was a hardtail, so only front suspension fork. My first bike was aluminum. Again, I wanted to buy a nice bike, a quality bike, but I didn't want to spend a ton of money on a bike, because when you're starting out, you really don't even know what you like about a bike. You don't even know about the different features yet that you're going to like, going to dislike. So my feeling was, I didn't want to spend a lot of money until I on my first bike. I was going to use my first bike to kind of try to figure those things out. Then when I figured them out and I kind of got a feeling more of what I liked, what I didn't like, then spend more money on my second bike. And that's basically what I did. So you have the full suspension versus hardtail. You have carbon fiber frame versus an aluminum frame. Carbon fiber frames are going to be more expensive. Aluminum frames are going to be cheaper. And then you have what we call the components. The components being primarily the drivetrain, which is your chain, your front chain ring, your cassette, your derailleur or derailleurs if you have a front derailleur, the cranks, the pedal, well, not the pedals because most of them don't come with pedals, but the cranks. That aspect of the bike is going to be your next, is kind of what we generally call the components. The brakes, I always consider brakes part of the components as well. And then you have your wheels and your wheel set, which is your hubs. That's the thing in the middle that the spokes go into, the rims, and then the spokes themselves. With the components, again, you want to get components that are nice, that are going to work well, but aren't going to be super expensive, the nicest components in the world, because, again, different brands feel a little different. You kind of don't know what you want yet. So my recommendation is go with something that's nice, but don't break the bank on the components. Personally, before I tell you personally what I would say is the lowest you should go, there are probably going to be two brands you're going to see. The first one is Shimano. The second one is SRAM, S-R-A-M. I have no idea where it comes from, but that's what it is. And I personally am a Shimano kind of guy, although I don't dislike the SRAM. I kind of prefer Shimano. Back in the day in the early 90s, I started riding mountain bikes in 90. Before that, I was on BMXs and freestyle bikes and stuff. In 1990, when I started riding mountain bikes, which I rode through about 98 or so, 99 maybe, before I laid off and got into rugby as kind of my full-time pastime. Shimano was all I recall. I mean, I don't remember even hearing about SRAM. So I probably have an affinity towards them because of that. I also feel like they shift a little bit cleaner. The stuff just feels a little bit crisper, but it's all really personal preference. And I know a lot of people who love SRAM, and there's certainly nothing wrong with them. In fact, my new bikes came with SRAM stuff, and my new Bronson, so it's cool. So you have Shimano, you have SRAM. If you're getting Shimano, you probably don't want to go below what's called the Deore. It's D-E-O-R-E components. The hierarchy in Shimano is Deore, then SLX, then Deore XT, and then XTR. And I've always loved XT back in the day, and then early 90s when I got my bike, I upgraded everything to XT. After I did my first race in my, I forget what the derailleur and shifter was that came on it, and it wasn't as crisp and clean, and I was getting passed on some of the uphills where I was shifting, and I was losing some time there. I quickly went out and got XT components. But Deore is perfectly fine on the first bike. SLX is perfectly fine on the first bike. If you're looking at a bike in the $800 to $1,000 range on a hardtail, you're probably going to be looking at Deore or SLX. If you're looking at a bike in a full suspension bike in the 2000s, you're probably going to be looking at Deore or SLX. If you get in the hardtail above the $1,000 range, you might be getting some XT components thrown in there. If you are on a full suspension bike, you might start seeing some XT when you start getting into above the $3,000 range, but you probably won't be seeing XTR. Those bikes tend to be very expensive. Those components are very expensive. A lot of times the higher end bikes will have some components that are XT and some components that are the cheaper, either Deore or SLX or something. To me, the things that are important are the shifter itself because how much you have to push down and the crispness of it is oftentimes determined by the quality of the shifter. The derailleur, I always like a derailleur that I just know is going to work, I'm not going to have problems with, and is going to just shift crisply. And then the brakes. And I'll talk about the brakes more in a minute. With SRAM, if you get a SRAM bike, probably your lower end builds are going to have what's called NX. NX nowadays is perfectly capable, perfectly fine. In fact, it's actually what came on my Bronson, and the reason I got it is because I'm probably going to upgrade or change from SRAM NX to probably Shimano XTR down the road. But it's cool. I mean, it works fine. Honestly, I can't really complain about it much. It's just not quite as crisp as I kind of like. But it's okay. It's fine. The next one up is GX, and then I think above GX then goes X01, and I think they might have another one above that. But you're basically going to be looking at either NX or GX. Again, if you're in that $800 to $1,000 range, you're definitely going to be looking at NX for a hardtail. If you're in that $2,000 range somewhere, again, you're going to have NX on a full suspension bike. Once you start getting above $1,000 for a hardtail, you might start seeing some GX on there. If you start getting above $3,000 for an aluminum full suspension bike, you might start seeing some GX on there. So it just depends on how much you want to actually spend on the components. Let's talk about the brakes for a minute. You don't want to get anything that doesn't have a disc brake on it. The old caliper brakes are substantially less stopping power than the disc brakes. When I went out, and I first, just to get back in this, I originally started it because I was trying to rehab an Achilles injury from rugby, and as long as I kept running on it, it just would never heal. But I didn't want to stop doing cardio and then get completely out of shape. So I was like, well, let me just start mountain biking again. That'll work. And I just went to a store and bought like a $250 mountain bike. Because honestly, I didn't think I was going to get into it. I thought I was just going to like ride on some paved trails and kind of that was it. Well, the bug bit me. I went from paved trails to dirt trails with roots and dirt trails with rocks and dirt trails that started getting steeper and pushed that bike way beyond its limits. It was a Diamondback, and I got to give that bike credit because, man, I really pushed that thing. And very quickly, within like, I don't know, 2 or 3 months, realized I had to get a better bike. And actually, the biggest reason I did it was not the frame, not the shifting, although it was starting to drive me a little nuts because it wasn't that great, but was actually the brakes. I was like outriding my stopping power, and that is not something you want on a mountain bike. Again, talk about getting that feeling of, I don't like this is not for me. Well, if you don't feel safe on the bike, and maybe you aren't actually safe on the bike because you're outriding your braking power, that's bad. So you want a bike that's going to be equipped with disc brakes, both front and rear, and the brakes are going to have the same level names as the drivetrain. On the Shimano side, it'll be Deore, SLX, XT, XTR in that order from lowest to highest. On the SRAM side, from lowest to highest, it'll be NX, GX, X01, then I think it's XX01. Again, I think whatever basically brakes you get that are Deore or above and NX or above, on the SRAM, they actually don't call them NX. They're level, which is the lowest ones, then guide, and then code. So level are going to be brakes more geared towards not riding super steep, super fast descents. Guides are when you start getting a little bit more into the faster speeds, steeper descents. And then codes are for if you're really like going all out, maybe you go to bike parks and things like that with it. With the Shimano side, XT is really where you start getting into brakes that are designed more for fast speeds, downhills, that sort of thing. So get a bike with disc brakes. Don't skimp and anything that has caliper brakes on it these days is actually not going to be a mountain bike for real mountain biking. After that, the handlebars, the stems, the grips, the saddle, and all that stuff, you'll get whatever you get, and you can replace those relatively easily. Grips, saddles, you can just see what you like and see how it feels. Those are easily replaceable. Pedals, you'll have to get pedals probably. They actually don't come on the bikes anymore. I personally recommend, unless you're coming from road riding where you're used to clipping in, those shoes that clip into the pedals, and you want to ride those, that's cool. But if you're just new to biking generally, especially mountain biking, I would suggest you get a pair of flat pedals. That's the kind that you can just wear regular shoes, sneakers on. And I would highly, highly recommend Deity. That's the brand name, Deity, like a god, D-E-I-T-Y. T-Mac is the pedal. It's a big, flat pedal with lots of little little cleats that come up to dig into your shoe, and it's slightly concave in the middle so that the ball of your foot rests kind of down into it. It will give you incredible grip. Your feet won't slip off. Yet if you feel like you want to put your foot down going around a corner, or feel like you have to bail on the bike because you're going into a crash or something, you can get off of them very easily. Stems, so the stem is the thing that's going to connect the handlebars to the bike. Those you want to be relatively short, probably 50 millimeters or under. You really shouldn't be looking at any bikes that I would say have stems longer than 50 millimeters. If they are, you're probably either looking at a bike that is designed for cross-country racing, which unless you're actually going to be cross-country racing, I wouldn't recommend as your first mountain bike. Or you're looking at a bike that, again, isn't a real mountain bike. If you go, for example, to like the box stores, Dick's Sporting Goods or something, and you look at an adult mountain bike there, they'll probably have this real long stem. It's not what you want. You want something shorter. The reason is a long stem puts your weight very far forward on the bike. Unless you're going to be doing a lot of climbing, like I said, in cross-country racing where climbing times are going to be super important, they can be scary as you-know-what on the downhills. You don't want to be forward on the bike. In fact, really what all mountain bikes are going for is trying to, in general, get your weight centered on the bike while riding seated, and when riding downhill, give you the ability to get your weight back, even be further behind the saddle, basically, so that you don't have that over the bars, not only feeling, but happening if you do get hung up going downhill. Gives you much more time if you do start pulling it over the bars to bail without actually going over the bars. And the final thing that you want to make sure you have on a bike, and this is probably, to me, the most game-changing thing of all the things they've done on mountain bikes, is what we call a dropper seat post. And what that means is that your seat post is going to be able to go up and down, just like your office chair where you push the thing and it slides up and down. Same thing. There's different ones that are, some use cables, some use hydraulic fluid, like some of the brakes actually are hydraulic. The better brakes are actually hydraulic fluid. Not hydraulic fluid, but they're a fluid, a hydraulic fluid. They're not cable actuated anymore. Some of them run internal, so they run through the cable will run through the frame up the seat post, so you never see it. Some will be external, where they run on the outside. It really doesn't matter the mechanics for your first bike quite as much, but the key is to get one. And why are they so important? Why does this matter? Because what it allows you to do is to drop the seat out of your way when you're about to hit a downhill, so that you can get your weight properly back on the bike so that you're safer when you're going down the downhills. And then when you hit an uphill or a flat, you can push the button, you pop the seat back up, and you're in a very comfortable pedaling position. The old days, when you had a steady seat post, you either just tried to move around it, which it did definitely hinder how far back you could get behind the seat, Or if you were going to like do a long sustained downhill, you'd stop, get off, lower the seat post, and go do your downhill. Even some of the trail features that you're going to run across, you will want to have the lower seat. So, for example, a lot of trails are going to feature log piles that mountain bikers people who maintain the trails will put in. And they're great. They're a great way to practice. Some of them can be high. I mean, I've gone over log piles that are as tall as I am. I'm 5'10". And there have been some back when I had my first bike, my Trek, my hardtail. That did not come with a dropper seat post. It came with a rigid. And there were some of those I could not get over with the seat post in my pedaling height. And the reason is, as the bike crests and starts to go over, the seat post, which is up here, if it's here as I'm going up, once I hit the top, it comes up like this, and it'll hit you in the butt and actually knock you forward over the handlebars. And so there were some of those log piles, once they started getting above about maybe 3 feet, that I would actually have to stop before, if I wanted to try them, lower the seat, go over the log pile, get on the other side, raise the seat back up. Same thing with some of the downhills. The downhills around Washington, D.C. here, I was fine. I could pretty much do those with my seat in my pedaling position. But when I went out to the mountains, some of the steep, long downhills, I'd stop, lower the seat, do the downhill. Of course, sometimes even on the downhills, there's little uphill parts in it. And then I'm stuck with my seat down, trying to pedal, and it's not particularly comfortable. Jumps, if you start trying to do any jumps, again, you got to have that seat down. I mean, if I was doing any jumps, on my hardtail, I would have to lower my seat. I actually went out and got an aftermarket, externally rooted, cable actuated dropper seat post, and put it on my hardtail. I love it. It's great. Like I say, to me, it makes the biggest difference for riding. I do have actually a video on here of it if you want to check it out. It's the E13, I think. E13. Yeah, it's the E13. What's the name of the dropper? I forget the name of the model. E13, I think, is the company that makes it. But super duper important. It's a phenomenal thing. You want to have that on your bike when you buy it. And the last thing I'll just say is, and by the way, that's going to cost some money. That's one of the reasons why you can't get a real mountain bike for less than $800, $1,000 probably, more likely if you're going to get the dropper, because you've got the front shock that costs a couple $100. I mean, you can look online at what they run. You've got the dropper seat post. You've got the derailleur, the shifters. All of those things are going to just increase the cost of it, but they're well worth, spending the money on. Don't chintz out on those things. So those are the things I think you're going to want to look at when you get your first mountain bike. After that, a lot of it is going to be feel. It's going to be, what you like, what you don't like, and you'll get the sense for it. For example, tires are a perfect example. Your bike may come with fairly small tires with relatively small knobs. They're meant for rolling, not for the best grip in the world. Depending on the types of trails you ride, you may love those. They might work great for you. Then, depending on the trails you ride, they might not. And you might start realizing that you're losing grip. And one of your first upgrades might be to go out and get some new tires that are stickier rubber, bigger knobs, etc. But that's something that you'll experience as you go along. And you can do, because, while they're not the cheapest things in the world, they're not a huge expense. You can do that after you've bought the bike. So with me, I spent $1,200 on my first bike when I got back into it. It was a Trek Excalibur, Excalibur 9. So it was the highest level Excalibur that they sold. It originally retailed for like $1,400 or $1,500, but what I did was I bought it 2 years old. So I bought it. It's a 2014. I bought it in 2016 as a 2-year-old model. Saved $300 or something there, and then got it out and started finding out what I liked, what I didn't like. What I bought, the X-Trek Excalibur 9 is primarily a cross-country racing oriented bike. It came with fast rolling, not real big knobby tires, a little bit of a longer stem. It had as a front and a rear derailleur. And as I started riding more and getting into it, I turned it into a little bit more of a trail bike. So what that means is I made it maybe not as good of an uphill climber anymore, but much more comfortable on the descents and with much better grip. So I shortened the stem, I put wider handlebars on it, I put better brakes on it because I started, actually when I took it out to the mountains, started out running my brakes. So I went up to the XT brakes, which did not come with it. And I put some grippier, fatter, knobbier tires on it in the form of Maxxis Minions. And then my final piece de resistance, if you will, it was the dropper seat post. I finally got that and put that on it. And it's a nice little hardtail trail bike. It's great. It climbs fine. It descends way better than it ever did. A lot of grip in the corners. I can really, when I take corners, I really like to lean the bike and really lean into that corner and whip the back end around. And the new tires allow me to do that. The brakes allow me to take it out to the mountains and hit some of those faster speeds and those downhills and have the confidence that I'm not going to go flying off the trail because I'm not going to be able to stop the damn bike. So I like it a lot. I will say, so I got it as a 3x. So it has a front derailleur. It has 3 chain rings up front, and then I think it either has 10 or 8 or 10 in the back. I can't remember. It's either a 24 or 30 speed. Quite frankly, it's probably actually too many gears. I got it because actually around DC, I tend to ride. Well, when I started, I thought I might be riding a little bit more on paved trails and stuff, which I don't. But I do still ride sometimes on roads or whatever just to get to the trailhead. And some of the trails around here actually are hard enough packed dirt and non-technical enough that I actually sometimes will find myself in that 3rd chain ring. So when I was kind of a newbie, I thought maybe I wanted the 3 chain rings, wanted all the gear range. Definitely don't need a 3x anymore. I mean, I would be happy with a 2x. But now I would probably go with a 1x. And this is the last thing I'll leave you with. The one thing you might want to consider when going between a 2x and a 1x, and I was a big 2x fan for a long time, and I still do like them. They have advantages, and I'll talk about, when I talk about the drivetrain video, I'll talk about this in more detail. But they definitely, they have their uses and they have their advantages. But the one big disadvantage to the 2x comes with its interaction with the dropper. So if you think about your setup on your cockpit or the handlebars, you're going to have your rear derailleur on the right, and you're going to have your front derailleur on the left, and also on the left is going to be your dropper seat post. So when you are trying to think about, when you're on a mountain bike, everything's coming at you quick. It's, for reaction time, you got to do it without thinking about it. And when you're having to think about or change both front derailleur and rear derailleur and drop your seat post at the right time for ups and downs, or raise it, as the case may be, if you're going down, if you're going up, it can be a lot to think about and a lot to get confused by. The simplicity of the 1x system, so you only have your shifter on the right and your dropper seat post on the left, definitely makes it so that there's less stuff to think about, there's less stuff to get confused by when you're out there on the trail, especially when you're new, and even at slower speeds, it's going to seem like the stuff is coming at you super fast. So that's the one thing I would say is if I did it again, I would, and also nowadays the 1x's are much better than they were back then. The gear range, the biggest issue when I bought them was that the gear ranges weren't that big. They didn't have a low enough gear because I don't ride as much as I would like to, and I'm not in the kind of shape that I can go in some of these, go up some hills in some of these higher gears that other guys can. I'm also a bigger guy. I'm 210 pounds. I need a little more help on the gearing to get up the hills. And back in the day, the one bys didn't really go low enough, but SRAM came out with the Eagle. Shimano has just come out with their version of these with a really big chain ring on the back that is now low enough to allow it. So I'll leave you with that. Really consider a one by with the dropper. It'll make it easier for you to start. But that's pretty much it. I would say 800 to 1500 probably for a hardtail. Personally, I actually would recommend above 1,000. If you're going to get into the sport, get into it. Spend a couple extra $100 to get a little bit better rig. Make sure you have that dropper seat post and stuff. On the full suspension, if you go that range, again, you're probably looking at about 2,500 to 3,500 for, and both of these are aluminum frames, by the way, not carbon fiber. I wouldn't recommend carbon fiber for a starter bike. You're looking at 2,500 to 3,500. Probably, realistically, I'd say consider more in like the $3,300 to $3,500 price range. For the same reason, again, if you're going to get something that's good. And then you'll be able to get out there. We'll talk about other specific parts of the bike and the considerations when buying those in the future videos. I hope you liked this. I hope it helped. If it did, give me a thumbs up. Any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below. I try to get back to people. And then just get out there, ride on, and have some fun, because that's what it's all about. And get a big smile on your face. So thanks, guys. I will see you next time on Dadventure TV.